Game 6 and Game 7. And in his first chance with the white pieces, this is what we got. Another e4 by Mr. Sergey Karjakin, and after e5, knight f3, knight c6, big surprise, the Ruy Lopez. Karjakin not going away from his pet opening, despite less than stellar results in Game 4, where we all know that Magnus Carlsen eventually had a winning position as black. And they repeated that exact game. Carlsen not going for the Berlin, playing a6 the main line, and after bishop a4, knight f6, castles, bishop e7, rook e1. Rook e1 defends the e-pawn, so officially in these moments in the Lopez, white is now threatening to take and actually win this e-pawn outright. So black always has to play b5. And after bishop b3, castles, and h3, we are right where we left off in Game 4, that exact game I was just describing. Seems likely that Carlsen will repeat that effort, given the fact that he got such a good position as black, right? Well, hold on. First, here's the one thing about this line to understand. h3, again, is played rather than the more traditional Lopez move c3. c3 is a move that prepares d4, and white loves to get two pawns in the center. But as we know, c3 is a move that not only chooses to move a pawn rather than develop a piece, but it actually slows down the development of white's queenside because it takes away natural squares. Ever since the Marshall attack really became the main response to c3, and ever since grandmasters, even at the highest level, proved that they are prepared to sacrifice a pawn in this position and then relocate their pieces to get jiggy with it over here on the king side, you just don't see c3 anymore at a high level. If that doesn't prove the validity of a gambit, that even at the highest level with all the resources in the world and the strongest computers and the strongest engines, they still avoid that gambit, if that doesn't tell you that black is probably getting more than enough compensation and that theory is done with, then I don't know what does. That's why we don't see it anymore. And that's exactly why we normally see this move h3, because from a principled perspective, white is playing this sort of high-class waiting move to take advantage of the fact that black still can't play knight a5 to eliminate the all-powerful Nimzo Ruy Lopez bishop, because if you play knight a5 before d6, you lose the pawn. So white is able to take advantage of the fact that you still can't play knight a5, and if I keep this c3 square open, you're much less likely to just go for d5 here, because once I eventually win this pawn, and you have to deal with defending this knight, I can now, in a lot of positions, develop my knight rather than deal with the dysfunction of the pawn taking the square and my queenside being a little bit tied down. So again, I know that for some of the viewers here that are more advanced, it might be, yeah, Danny, we've heard this story before. It's the basic description of very well-known theory in the Ruy Lopez and why the Marshall attack is good for black. But I always want to make sure I set the foundation for what was fundamentally going on in the position before we get into the complex stuff that the players actually played in the game. It'll help us understand what's going on in a few moves, believe me. So h3 was played, but as I said, we're still repeating Game 4. Black plays bishop to b7, and after d3, as you remember in Game 4, Magnus played the move d6. And after d6, we saw a3, knowing a4 is also a way to play the position. And the game proceeded to go down roads that, as we know, eventually led to Magnus being better. And it would seem in all likelihood, why wouldn't he just repeat that, right? Well, no. Magnus Carlsen loves to be the first one to play something different, and he loves to put his opponents on their heels. And so he played the move that should surprise you, given everything I just described about why d5 doesn't work, because the c3 square is open. He played the move d5. Now, the key point to this move is an idea that actually Levon Aronian, a very strong grandmaster from Armenia, many people know that name, really was the first to at least not try. He was the first to really popularize it at a high level. The idea is that after takes, and knight takes e5. Indeed, white is up a pawn, and if we go down normal Marshall roads of taking e5 and rook takes e5, probably everything I just said about the c3 square still being available for white to develop quickly, and the fact that white won this pawn should be enough for white to be a little bit better. Now, I'm being a little bit overzealous in that because these days black has tried this, and they played the move queen to d6 rather than bishop to d6 or bishop to f6, and black is proving that there is some compensation here to be found in the attack that occurs on the king side. So it's interesting. It's not exactly the kind of pressure black gets in the traditional Marshall attack I described, so I would be right to say that the philosophical point that white does get to develop the queen side more naturally does make a difference for white in these lines. It's not really as clear that this gambit works for black, but I don't want to leave you with the opinion that you can't take on e5 at all if you're black. But what I want to state is that regardless of that idea, really what made this line start working for black at the high levels is not knight takes e5 and going into a martial attack where white has the development square for the knight, the foundation I set for you. What really started making this line work for black at the high levels was that black started playing this move, declining the capture of the knight, leaving white sort of maybe to his surprise with a good piece in the center, but actually taking advantage of the fact that because that knight left this d4 square behind, I can now bring my knight to d4 and finally eliminate the Lopez bishop, the bishop that causes black problems and so many variations and many weird dreams. So knight to d4 is exactly the kind of move that black needed to sort of justify this d5 sacrifice that normally was reserved for white having bad development on the queen side. Now, this is theory, though, so what happens next? The move knight to c3 was played by Karjakin. This move is already a little bit of an awkward move order. Probably bishop to d2 could be argued as a slightly better, slightly more popular move order. I'm going to explain what happens here right now, just so when I provide context to that in the main game, you'll remember. Black is going to play c5. There's no rush to take this bishop because not going anywhere for a while. It's busy chewing on a Snickers. And after knight to c3, now we take it because there's pressure on d5 with two pieces. So we capture and double the pawns. And the main point is that even though the a file becomes open, black is able to stick this pony on b4 where, very irritatingly so, it hits c2, which makes the queen not really able to move. You don't have this pawn on a3 anymore to kick the pony. And so it's one of the key points to justifying this whole sacrifice that not only did black get rid of this dominant Lopez bishop, but the knight takes a surprisingly irritatingly strong post on the queen side. And even if this knight moves, in a lot of positions, you don't really want to give up the bishop pair, because these two will run wild in an open position, and you can never play c3 because d3 hangs. So the game is not over at all. In fact, after knight e4, f5, knight g3, there's been some different games in this line, including one by Sergey Karjakin versus Alex Onashuk at the Olympiad in 2010. But Sergey chose not to go for this. Maybe he either trusts that black does have compensation for the pawn in these lines, or he just didn't want to give Magnus Carlsen the chance to come up with an improvement over what Onashuk did against him in the Olympiad. Not sure exactly what his reasoning was. He did go on to beat Onashuk in that Olympiad. What the heck, since we're talking about it, might as well show you all the analysis I prepared in full. That game went like this, repeating at a bluff and then took on b4, giving black the bishop pair with d4 and then queen d3. Now, don't take that as, okay, Karjakin won, this is how white should play. Again, he obviously chose not to go for this, so he decided Onashuk had more than he got, or eventually Onashuk messed up later on. As we can see, the point is that we got some weird positions here where white's attack on the king side got a little bit out of control, and eventually Onashuk was forced to resign because of the threats coming for checkmate. But so regardless of that, we see the dynamic imbalance of this position. You have black being down a pawn, but with a bishop pair that he's going to win, and with potentially more control over the center to go with this sort of irritating knight. White is up a pawn, and a pawn is a pawn, no matter where you live, along with hopefully some dynamic equality once these knights get going in the center. So showing you this sort of dynamic sort of paints the picture as to what could happen in these lines and what the variations are that both these players were probably thinking about during the game. But after knight to d4, not only did Karjakin not repeat his game against Onashuk, I've already sort of planted my seeds of conspiracy theory. Is it because he didn't want Carlsen to improve upon it? I don't know. He just played the move knight to c3 instead, developed, which is a natural move. And if you remember after knight b4, if white had played bishop to d2 here, there's a good chance on c5, knight e4, if you recognize the position, that we could have got a direct transposition to that game with Onashuk. But that's just it. You already saw me reveal it. Karjakin didn't play bishop d2. For some reason, he played bishop f4. Grandmaster Alex Yermolinsky, who appeared on Chess Center, the live show we hold after every game. Again, go watch it on chess.com TV. He was very heavy of this move. He said it was sort of an empty move, a move that develops a piece for development's sake. That's a term I use when I'm teaching a lot of beginner players. Not something you should do to just put a piece on an active square in the center because it makes me feel good and I'm following chess principles. Sorry for the weird Stuart Smalley voice. But that's what this move kind of does. And it doesn't really, the bishop on d2 actually has a purpose despite how passive it looks, which is that at some point we may want to capture this pony and double the pawns. And so it's good tips for all the viewers at home to take note of, that you really you don't ever want to fall prey to just getting pieces out or getting developed and then I'll figure out what I'm going to do. Let me get castled and connect the rooks and I figure out what I'm going to do. That's just, these guys are not doing that. I'm not implying that's what Sergey Karjakin did at all. But it's something that a lot of people do whenever they're in an opening that they're not quite sure of. They go back into the sort of fetal position of a chess player. When you're a baby chess player, you say, let me get all my pieces developed and let me get my king safe and then I'll figure out what to do, which is really counterintuitive. You should be thinking about how to get your king safe and where the pieces need to go. Develop with purpose, not just develop for development's sake, right? So, but Yerma was critical of this move and said it really doesn't make sense in his view to the position. Black is going to go for c5 anyway, which is exactly what Carlsen did the moment he eliminated the bishop. He played c5, and he feels like the bishop has no real life purpose here. Either way, whether Carlsen was prepared for bishop f4 despite its lack of purpose, or if Carlsen really just executed it very well over the board. Knowing what I know about the press conference, I can pretty much assume that Carlsen was actually just super well prepared in this line. He's showing people that he knows what he's doing. Either way, Black got really frisky here as soon as the knight came to e4. Played the move f6, and then after the move f5, Carlsen had spent a total of, I think, about 8 minutes on the game or something. He was playing very fast. So there wasn't much really to think about before. I mean, all the way up until at least this moment, it was 100% theory until bishop f4. So if he knew what he wanted, he could just do it. That's not that surprising. But if bishop f4 is sort of a weird original move, the fact that Carlsen handled it so quickly and so well is impressive. And the whole point, everybody, is that f5, despite the risks it looks to be taking here, is a very strong move because it's forcing the opening of this diagonal. And once this diagonal opens, that's when the battery gets going and threats of g2 come right after it. So the thing about f5 is white has two choices. Do I go knight e to g5 and go for all the forcing lines that can occur where I'm going after e6 and you're going after the battery? Or should I try to play knight e to d2? I'm going to say that even though it leads to this lots of tactics and smoke and simplification of the position, I think Karjakin made the right decision to go knight e to g5. Knight e to d2 is solid, but after some natural moves, maybe bishop f6 hitting the pawn, again, you can't play c3. This is an idea we already highlighted. Bishop e5, rook e8. You know, it's a position where you don't like the knights fighting and wrestling each other for squares. You don't like the threat that Black will eventually have of bringing the queen here. And it's hard to just suggest any good moves for white. You can't move the queen, you can't move the pawn, so that's a bind. And it makes sense as to why Karjakin didn't want to say, well, I'll keep my pawn and play passively. He's like, I know this is about to lead to some craziness, but let's go for it. After knight g5 takes, don't ever blunder a piece, kids. If you take with the bishop thinking, oh, I'm so excited, right, I'm gaining a little bit of a tempo on his queen, yeah? Right. Always consider the in-between move, yeah? Bishop takes f3. Getting your queen first, followed by winning a piece. Okay, even if queen to d2, queen f3 comes in this position is a nightmare because the knight is coming back around and Bob's your uncle over there on the king side. So never forget to not just consider the obvious forcing move, but the little itty baby, right, in between move, yeah? Anyway, that's just a pro tip from an English guy who somehow tranced through my body right there. I have no idea who he is or where he came from. After knight takes g5, h6, knight e6. This is exactly the line we expected once knight e to g5 was played. Note that knight f3 is not really possible. Now you can take it. Queen can't take because that's an exchange fork. And if you take with the pawn, this is the kind of position that nobody writes their mom and dad about. So, knight e6 is played, and after the move queen to d5, f3, rook f e8. I admit that during the game, I was super confident that this was about to go super wrong for Karjakin. Not only because of Carlsen's fast pace play, which suggested very deep understanding and preparation, but also the fact that I couldn't come up with a good move here. Try it yourself, right? If the knight moves to c7 and goes for a big old fork town, Black has queen to d4 check, picking up all kinds of stuff. Your knight is under attack. It's not that easy, right? And Karjakin, to his credit, he found pretty much the only move in the position, rook to e5, a move that attacks the queen and then allows him to now play this sort of weird tempo move that opens up all kinds of tactics. Black plays rook takes e6, and the reason is that knight takes d3 before, as the key point showing that why c3 didn't work, no longer works for Black after the move rook to e3. Exclaim. Look how weird this pin position is. The knight defends the bishop, so you can't take with the queen. But you can't take with the knight because you lose your queen. And you got to deal with your queen because she's under fire. So you move the queen, and then white's going to take on d3, and some things are going to get weird. First, this, whoa, quite the intermezzo. I love this analysis. Again, props to Bobby Hess and all the prep he did. But giving that knight with tempo prevents even further coordination, and this rook is entering with gusto along the d-file. So that was some tactics that could have occurred, and luckily for Sergey, he had calculated it well, knew he could justify c3. Unlucky for him, all it did was save him from brilliant preparation by Magnus Carlsen, because after rook takes e6 and trades, we were headed toward exactly what you see, a massive simplification and an opposite code bishop ending. Unfortunately, unlike the previous opposite code bishop ending in game 5, this one really had very little to play for. The players making natural moves of just trade pawn for pawns, and after moves like king h2, a5, queen e3, bishop d5. Exchanges are happening, pawns are being taken, and the game is being agreed to a draw, with neither side really having anything to play for. So, in hindsight, where does that leave us in terms of the match, right? We have a situation where the match is tied. The match is tied, 3 games apiece at the halfway point. We've gotten there in the least exciting way possible, 6 draws. Has it been all just peaceful business? No, there's been some fighting spirit, and I think as much as I joked and had criticisms for Karjakin, even on Twitter, asked for him to try for more as white, upon further review, past my emotional tweet, I can say that, because like all fans, I was frustrated we didn't see more. The truth is that I think he was just taken surprise by brilliant preparation from the world champion Magnus Carlsen. So reminder real quick, our next live show is after Game 7 on Sunday, November 20th at 5 p.m. Pacific. That's where you'll find me and the full host and cast of characters talking about everything going on in the World Championship. So that's where we stand. We learned something, I think, a lot about the Lopez and sort of the philosophy of this position and how the understanding of it has evolved. We also learned a little bit about the critical moments of the middle game and making sure you look for intermezzos where the English guy came through, right? And just never underestimating Magnus Carlsen's opening preparation. Excuse my tying myself up there at the tongue. I need some coffee, right? Hey, go check out all your friends live inside your computer. So there you go. I need some coffee.